Patty Ingham, one of the editors of Exemplaria, and it's my pleasure to welcome you back to day 2. So I think we really, yesterday was a really fantastic sort of opening to the event, and we had a lot of really terrific conversation answering the question posed by the symposium. You know, well, it's not really a question, I suppose. Filling in the blanks on the statement posed by the symposium, the way we do theory now. So today, our first panel today is going to be on philosophies of theory, but before turning to my introductions of our panelists, I just wanted to start by saying that one of the things we as the editors would like to do with the conversation that we've started here is there will be a kind of special issue related to the questions raised in the symposium, to which presenters are certainly welcome to submit versions of their talks that they gave, but we're also actually thinking, and you'll hear more on this probably in the next 3 or 4 weeks, we're also thinking about asking presenters to offer shorter position papers based on their talks, and then would invite those of you in our audience here, or those of you out in YouTube land, in our audience, listening to this feed, to submit responses to any of those particular papers. So part of what we're trying to do in a special issue that will come out of this symposium is generate conversations on these topics, on the topics raised by the symposium. So think about that. It's now my pleasure to introduce our illustrious speakers in the panel Philosophies of Theory. And they are going to be kept to a very strict 20 to 25 minute presentation time. I'm saying that out loud publicly, so that they are meant to be responsible for that. We're going to start with our first paper is given by Mark Miller. Mark Miller is Associate Professor of English at the University of Chicago. He was, for a brief, happy moment, the book review editor here at Exemplaria. He is currently completing a book on Ricardian poetry's resistance to narratives of ethical self-improvement, political reform, and spiritual ascent, with a tentative title, The Unredemptive Middle Ages. And he's speaking today on the medieval irreparable.
Thank you, Patty. And before I get started, I just want to say a thank you in a slightly different mode than has been offered so far to Exemplaria, to all the editors of Exemplaria, and the work that journal has done. As I'm sure everyone in this room has at some point had experience of, we have a field that is not just still, despite many efforts, conservative intellectually, but risk averse in a lot of ways, and that's especially damaging for advanced graduate students and assistant professors who I think are structurally invited to not take chances with their thinking, and this is a journal that, through its editorial policies and practices and the kinds of responses it's given work, has really encouraged people to keep thinking, and that's an immense gift to those people and to the field. So, okay, so now you can start the clock. And my title has shifted a little bit. It's now The Redemptive Hypothesis. The subject of my talk today is the long-standing problem of the relation between the work of theory in medieval studies and the place of medieval culture's theological commitments. My aim is to direct our attention to a critical blind spot produced by what I will call the redemptive hypothesis, and to offer the beginnings of an alternative way of understanding the theoretical path opened by Christian theology. The critical blind spot I hope to bring into view takes its shape from the innovative theoretical contributions of a range of work over the past 20 years or so. These innovations push back in different ways against a traditionalist complaint prevalent in the early days of medievalist engagements with capital T theory. You will all doubtless remember the complaint, since it still manifests itself at times, that the application of theory to pre-modern texts is anachronistic, partly because people back then didn't think that way, and usually this had something to do with an appeal to medieval theological commitments. and partly because the problems explored by modern theory were understood to be specific to modern culture, modern economic forms, modern subjects, and so on. On the one hand, medievalist work informed by theory was charged with a lack of respect for medieval culture. On the other, with a lack of respect for theory itself, for the fit between theory's analytical methods and the objects for which they were devised. The place of theory in the field now is largely the product of a number of responses to that traditionalist suspicion, thanks to which the need to play defense has somewhat abated. I will mention 4. One came first from feminist and psychoanalytic critics who argued that theory is crucial for understanding medieval culture, precisely because it gives us terms for analysis that the culture itself could not provide. As Aranya Friedenberg in particular argued in a series of articles in the 90s, the charge of anachronism assumes that a historically defined culture is transparent to itself. Otherwise, why think it is in possession of the best terms for understanding it? Once we reject that presupposition, the path is open to think in whatever terms can give us a purchase on the cultural phenomena we are investigating. Sometimes that purchase can best be had precisely from theory that puts analytical pressure on the cultural and conceptual commitments our texts exhibit. A second kind of responses come from critics who have explored medieval theology itself as a site of theoretical innovation and contestation. As the subfield of vernacular theology studies, in particular, has emphasized, the blocky contrast between a world of theological certainties and the questions of modern theory becomes less convincing the more you know about what seemed up for grabs for medieval people. And once that question is on the table, even assertions of absolute doctrine can start to sound like responses to a problem rather than unquestionable bedrock. A third response has come from the recent resurgence of historically informed formalism in medieval studies, which has extended accounts of theoretical experimentation in medieval culture towards an exploration of the eminent work of theory in literary texts. This is what Nicolette Zeman has called imaginative theory, which, as she argues, is not reducible to any set of explicitly articulated propositions, either in literary texts or elsewhere, and which, because it is eminent in form rather than explicitly propositional, requires theoretical work on the part of critics to understand. Finally, although this is by no means meant to be an exhaustive list, a fourth kind of responses come in the work of critics like Bruce Holsinger and Andrew Cole, who have argued that modern theory itself has strong roots in the Middle Ages and in the engagements of modern theorists with medieval culture, including medieval theory. To imagine any kind of sharp divide between modern theory and the medieval world is thus quite far from the historicist rigor to which such a posture wishes to lay claim, since it requires ignorance of the history whereby what we call theory came to be in the first place. Much of the intellectual vitality of medieval studies today stems from these 4 kinds of work and their intersection. But as I said, I think there is a critical blind spot even here. It's not a matter of some incorrect theoretical position to which we've all been committed. It's more a matter, as the trope of a blind spot suggests, of where we've been looking. Let me run back through the above examples of theory work. Friedenberg's argument that psychoanalysis can help us diagnose medieval culture's fantasies of redemption powerfully illuminates the ways such fantasies operate in the organization of gendered, classed, and in other ways embodied medieval subjectivities. But her focus is, in a sense, the same as the traditionalist one. In diagnosing texts' fantasies of redemption, Friedenberg takes it that their aim is to repair the subject's waywardness or recuperate the subject's losses. This elision of redemption with repair and recuperation is the redemptive hypothesis, in short. Work on vernacular theology shares that central organizing framework while complicating in a different way than Friedenberg does how we might understand the drive to repair or recuperation in the period, as for example in the renewed appreciation of Julian of Norwich's experiments with theorizing redemption. New formalist criticism that takes an interest in theology, and more broadly in ethics, also tends to preserve a reparative framework, arguing for their texts' ethically and spiritually transformative aims, and understanding the critical task to be that of explaining how the text's formal structures allow them to pursue such aims. See, for instance, Zeman's work on Langland or Eleanor Johnson's work on ethics in prosometric form. And Andrew Cole, in working through the relationship and distinctions between medieval and Hegelian dialectic, argues that the distinctness of medieval dialectic from Plotinus on resides in its aim of leading the subject beyond its fragmented temporal and material existence through a process of spiritual ascent towards unity with the divine. Now, my point isn't that it's time to change the subject and talk about something else. Medievalists have always also been talking about other things, lots of other things. My claim is rather that right in the space of medieval ethical, political, and spiritual desire, something else is going on, something that gets distorted by the redemptive hypothesis. Seeing that something else is difficult because redemption and repair are all over the place in medieval texts of all kinds and are all over the place in quite close proximity. Both texts that are overtly theological and those that are not constantly yearn for, fantasize about, theorize, and labor with redemption, and they do so because of how deeply they are moved by a sense that something is wrong in us and in the world we make, something that requires fixing. And redemption is right at the heart, of course, of the Christian tradition, right at the heart of its meditations on brokenness and repair, and that has pervasive effects on the culture that go well beyond moments when subjects and texts are explicitly thinking about it. How could there be a historically attentive medievalism, theoretical or not, that does not attribute a reparative logic to its objects, at least when ethical, political, and spiritual desire is what's at issue? I'm trying to make that question as askable as much as I am trying to answer it today. To take another shot at that, let me turn briefly to Zeman and Langland. Zeman's book on Piers Plowman is brilliantly attentive to that text's relentless self-questioning, its reversals and startings over, its dizzying aporias. Her core argument, as I understand it, is that the poem's repetition of failure across various forms and modes, aesthetic, ethical, political, spiritual, stokes desire through its dissatisfactions, thereby renewing it, preparing it for receptivity to a divine telos that is strictly speaking unimaginable, and that therefore can only be misapprehended by any and all of our representational efforts. This is very close to my understanding of the poem as well, but I think there is a critical short circuit in Zeman's articulation of a redemptive purpose in which loss gets recuperated and suffering is made good as the subject is opened to the beneficial trajectory of desire. Langland seems to me to insist too much, and with too much focused intelligence, on what can never be recuperated in loss, and on the losses in what looks like success, for his purpose to be that of invoking loss in order to direct his readers beyond it. Too concerned with one's ongoing responsibility to ethical and political and spiritual problems, even when the terms in which they have been represented have been shown to be problematic and overturned in the poem, for the pure form of their overturning itself to be the point of it. Too focused on the representational thickness of the subject's self-divisions as a site of critical attention to reduce them to a series of media that can be discarded as the subject is driven on its path of ascent by the operations of desire. What makes this short circuit happen, I think, is just the intuitive force of the redemptive hypothesis. Langland is clearly not a writer of despair or a postmodern ironist. He is clearly committed to a theology and a historical narrative in which Christ appeared in human form and redeemed us. All of those dead ends and aporias in the poem then must be serving some reparative purpose. If he isn't representing a reparative movement in the text itself, as one reading, not Zeman's, goes, then he must be aiming to produce one in the reader. That's the redemptive hypothesis in a nutshell. If we grant points 1 and 2, which I do, then the third seems necessarily to follow. And if that's true for Langland, how much more must it be true for texts that seem less relentlessly aimed at problematizing anything that looks like a solution? The critical blind spot, then, has to do with the difficulty of seeing a space in between a large-scale commitment to a Christian theology and history of redemption and its seemingly necessary connection to representing a trajectory of repair, or if not that, at least rhetorically aiming to produce one in the reader. A way of putting my claim that something else is going on would be to say that Langland, for all of his interest in the moral and spiritual conditions of individuals and collectivities, is not pursuing anything like a pastoral or pedagogical project. He is not trying to make individuals or society better. His interest is analytical rather than rhetorical, an interest in what makes ethical, political, and spiritual life fundamentally and inescapably fraught. Although I don't have time to cash this out here, I would argue that everything in Langland's poetry that looks like a moment of redemptive normative stability is a fantasy, a view I take it that is close to Zeman's, and that the reason he does this is not to try to drop-kick his readers out of fantasy into the real of an encounter with the divine, but rather to keep bringing them back into that inescapable place, repeatedly opening the structure of fantasy to analysis, exploring both its underlying incoherences and the ways it nevertheless produces recognizable and functional social and psychic forms. And that's as true of the late representations of Christ, the harrowing of hell, etc., as it is of earlier moments in the poem. Something similar is true, I think, of Chaucer, Gower, and the Pearl Poet. This is a thought I'm developing in the space of theory in the context of reading a good deal of psychoanalytic Marxist and other theorists trying to understand the workings of ideological fantasy, but I don't think that Langland and company are somehow proto-post-Althusserian theorists. Andrew Cole has pointed us in the right direction here. The intellectual resources on which they are drawing are right there in medieval culture. If I had time, I would pursue this as a thought about medieval dialectic, which I understand differently than Andrew does, I think. Something I understand as a tradition of producing and thinking through apparatic structures rather than one of ascent towards the beyond of discourse. But I suspect this is more a matter of different traditions within medieval dialectic than a substantive disagreement. I'm not about to argue with Andrew's reading of Plotinus. But I have a question about Boethius and the tradition stemming from him, Alain de Lille, Jean de Meun, how Chaucer engages with those guys, Langland, and so on. But instead, what I want to do for the rest of the time I have is focus on another question, for there's another blind spot, and an even more obscure one, a harder one to see, internal to an account of what redemption means in the first place. I will attempt to make out that deeper blind spot by turning to the foundational text of Christian theology, the letters of St. Paul. And since I may run out of time while I'm doing this, I'm just going to front load by saying the central claim I want to make about Paul is that, as zeroed in as he is on the redemptive power of the Christ event, to the exclusion of any real concern with Jesus' life, his miraculous acts, or the details of his teachings beyond the core reduction of the law to the law of love, Paul understands that redemptive power as splitting rather than unifying the Christian subject. And what remains, I'm going to try to lay out in brief what I mean by that. But first, just take note that if anything like that is true, then it's a good bet that there is a robust Christian tradition for which the redemptive hypothesis misunderstands redemption itself. Redemption for Paul, also for Augustine, Bernard of Clairvaux, the Cloud of Unknowing, Langland, Chaucer, Pearl, marks a point of fundamental orientation for the Christian subject that is also fundamentally and inescapably disorienting. Any account of it must hold on to both its orienting and disorienting aspects. If you lose hold of the first, you get something too close to postmodern irony. If you lose hold of the second, you get sentimentality in the form of too easy appeals to betterment or enlightenment or grace. So really quickly, since I don't have time to trace the entire argument, let me conclude. Again, I'll just try to flesh out the main point, and then I'll go back and fill in as much as I can on Paul until my time runs out. So, 4 points to take away. 1, Paul understands human, particularly human action, as the site of deep normative self-division. 2, Paul does not think he has a cure for it. He does not think that Christ's death and resurrection cures it. Whatever Christian redemption is, it is something that exists in the very space of deep and irreparable self-division. 3, this is something the redemptive hypothesis leads us to miss, not only in Paul, but in our reading of the entire Christian tradition, as when we make arguments about how Langland or Gower or the Pearl Poet educate the reader into a redeemed moral or spiritual condition. 4, a Pauline path against the redemptive hypothesis is not the only one. The Ricardian poets inherit multiple traditions that directly counter it. Beyond the Pauline tradition, one such path is the intersection of Christian theology with Aristotelian ethics and psychological theory. The tradition of Boethian dialectic is another. The tradition of post-Chartrian allegorical dream vision is yet another. Okay, back to Paul. For Paul, I think the subject is just split, period, irreparably. What the redemptive moment of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection does is to articulate that condition in a certain way, forcing our attention to it, bringing it to a crisis point. Paul's most succinct and tropologically dense formulation of the split subject comes in Romans 7:14-25. For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin. For that which I do, I allow not. For what I would, that do I not. But what I hate, that do I. If then I do that which I would not, I consent unto the law that it is good. Now then, it is no more I that do it, but sin that dwelleth in me. For I know that in me, that is, in my flesh, dwelleth no good thing. For to will is present with me, but how to perform that which is good I find not. For the good that I would, I do not, but the evil which I would not, that I do. Now if I do that I would not, it is no more I that do it, but sin that dwelleth in me. I find then a law that, when I would do good, evil is present with me. For I delight in the law of God after the inward man, but I see another law in my members, warring against the law of my mind, and bringing me into captivity to the law of sin, which is in my members. O wretched man that I am, who shall deliver me from the body of this death? I thank God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then with the mind I myself serve the law of God, but with the flesh the law of sin. All right, this passage, I think, sounds a lot more like it offers a resolution of something than it actually does, or is meant to. The fundamental thing Paul is doing here is articulating a mystery of self-division and the failure of self-knowledge. Following the Revised Standard Version of verse 15, I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. It might seem that his path through that mystery is ultimately a dualist, if not a Platonist one. It can't exactly be that. But it might seem that it's dualist as he builds the passage around a package of parallel contrasting terms. The inward man delights in the law of God, thus setting up a law of the mind, which is opposed by another law, the law of sin, that rules the outward man, the members, the flesh. In that case, there would be no split subject on Paul's account, since self-division would be explicable in terms of a division between the true self, the inward man, the mind or spirit, the core of the subject's being, and an alienating substance in which the subject is trapped, the outward man, the body or flesh. But it would be a mistake to assimilate Paul's language here to any familiar dualizing thought. Much in Paul's writings would make any such assimilation strained, from his critique of Greek rationalist wisdom to his attestation that Christ represents God's embodiment to his figuring of ultimate blessedness in terms of a reunion with the body in incorruptible form.
2 minutes.
Okay, I'll get there. I'll go fast. For these reasons, among others, historians such as Peter Brown and Carolyn Bynum, as well as philosophers such as Alain Badiou and Giorgio Agamben, have concluded that the Pauline flesh, far from being a term that resolves the mystery of self-division by figuring the split between what one wills and what one does, in terms of a split between the true inner self and the recalcitrant matter in which one is embedded, is itself a condensed metaphorical formulation of that mystery. So I'm going to really quickly try to track out how that mystery unfolds a little bit. That's what I think we need to do, rather than leap to a schematic sense of how it might be resolved. The passage begins by deploying the trope of carnality to attest to the subject's captivity, which itself is a figure for his alienation from the spiritual force of the law. The law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin. But the subject can't be reduced to his captivity. And yet another trope, it's as though it were moved by or inhabited by a force that moves it against its will. If I do that I would not, it is no longer I that do it, but sin that dwells in me. What I do is no longer something that I do, because Paul refuses to identify himself with his actions, even though he's compelled to perform them. But that does not mean that there is a real I firmly rooted in the spirit or the law. Rather, the only I there is remains divided against the spiritual law, even as it is divided against the forces in it that move it towards sin. All right, so if I had time, I would turn to a discussion of Paul's account of the law itself. Instead, I'm just going to conclude by saying what I think the upshot there is. It is not that the new law of love written in the heart has just replaced the old Mosaic law of external prohibitive rules. The new law of love does have absolute normative authority, but the subject is and must always be traversed by the old law as well, articulated by a logic of the law that is at once a logic of prohibition and a logic of identity forms, which the Christian subject must no longer take as absolute. So the key point about Paul, I think, is that there's a fundamental incompatibility between what he understands the cross to signify and all recognizable identity forms. That is why Paul repeatedly refers to the cross as a stumbling stone. But it's not as though Paul thinks we can move beyond the ego or the ethnos or the articulable law. He knows full well that there must be an articulated law, that there is no such thing as an organized psyche or group without it. That's one reason he also continues to refer to the law as holy and good. Subjects must be able to specify their paths, and Paul himself does a good deal of such specification in his writings, even as he tries to detach such exhortations from the voice of the law.
You could say one more thing.
I will say this one last sentence. On Paul's account then, see, the subject, the I, is split because its capacity to organize and recognize itself involves a drive to psychic reification, which has the effect of giving what he calls splendor to the self, both at the level of the individual and at that of the group or ethnos, as the imagined core of the subject. But at the same time, the subject is called by a reality beyond the ego or the group, beyond its reifications, called by what he calls the spirit, a normative drive beyond the law, beyond anything specifiable in a set of rules. Okay.
Professor of English at the University of California, Berkeley, where he is also graduate chair in English and co-chair of the program in critical theory. He is currently working on 2 projects, Modernism's Metaphysics, In Search of Absent Causes, and After Effects, Late Capital, Late Style. So he's a modernist interloper in our midst, but we welcome him.
And so I will apologize for irresponsibilities and stipulate them, I suppose. Liz's confirmation yesterday that the organizing prompt of this event was provided by one of the recent calls to have done with critique in the name of something called surface reading, or choose your term, sketches an accidental context to this paper in a few contradictory and perhaps amusing, or perhaps not, ways. With all due respect to my friends and colleagues, Best and Marcus, it will probably not be divulging anything very surprising to confess that what most would probably expect, and what they, Best and Marcus, certainly know after several rounds of disagreement, which is simply that I tend to find myself at the far edge of the dissenting wing when it comes to the now several iterated perorations and special issues of the way we read now. Surface reading, description, active network theory, and so on. At least at the board meetings. The echo of a Trollope novel signaled in that title, The Way We Live Now, The Way We Read Now, has from the beginning seemed to me to stipulate, or perhaps better to confess, the range of the argument and the method there claimed, whatever its self-description. It is a method perfectly good if one is willing to trust the Trollopian surface in the name of a finally smooth aesthetic or hermeneutic in the pursuit of something that I would describe as a new appreciation rather than a reading in any meaningful sense. But that method otherwise evades the actual challenge of textual effects by assuming causes away. Hence the now inverted fetish of the disavowed symptom and the general silence in the face of the logical situation that gave rise to it. A text in Althusser's classic account of Marx's classic account of Adam Smith that knows something that it also lacks the conceptual instrument to think. A text or a cultural object that knows then, but without knowing what it knows. As some here are aware, and as everyone else might now have guessed, I arrived to this symposium, as Patty says, as the outsider, with a long interest in the question of theory in this strong symptomal sense, but grounded at a far distance from medieval or early modern studies. One, most narrowly, in the problem posed by the modernist or avant-garde work of art, with its contradictory tendency to postulate or encode a claim on knowledge that entails no particular epistemological authority of an idealist sort, as I've just put it, that knows but forswears any particular power to think what it knows. And two, more generally, in this problem of theory and what seems to me its often vexed definitional relation to the more familiar cognitive ambitions furnished by philosophy, designed in the dominant classical or medieval forms precisely to know. So I won't claim here to have any particular insight or oversight concerning the work that theory does or has done in medieval, though I've also long been a little mystified that medieval could ever have been other than theoretical. But as I'll hope to explain, theory seems to me as good a name as any for the basic contradiction under which philosophy has come to tell us what we do or cannot know. And without saying anything in particular about medieval or early modern studies, it does seem to me that a certain medieval problem of knowing necessarily inheres in what I take theory to do in that circumstance. So when asked to think about the way we do theory now, bracketing Trollope for the moment, I returned inevitably to this problem and to a provisional, somewhat unsatisfactory definition that I've offered on a few occasions before, suggesting that, like philosophy, whatever we call theory is a conceptually grounded and regulated truth practice, but one lacking in what Kant would have called representations, or at least in the unity of representations with which Kant defines thinking, denken. To put it a little more simply, like philosophy, theory is organized, and I would say teleologically organized, that's the problem to which I'll return, by its orientation to the concept. But unlike philosophy, as a matter of historical fact, theory cannot presuppose the representability of any concept toward which it is oriented. Reduced to its crudest form, that's my suggestion. That theory involves the technical task of knowing, but without recourse to what we think of as thinking. So I'll approach this obstreperous postulate in two parts. The first and slightly longer, under the title already listed, Theory After Thinking. The second, more elliptically, a little more dangerously perhaps, though maybe not here, called Teleology Displaced. So Theory After Thinking. By way of context, I don't offer this almost scholastic distinction between thinking and knowing merely to pontificate, but rather to work through a question that has been nagging at me for some time. It's a question that, as with so many, very many things in one's life, can be entirely blamed on Andrew Cole. The question is provoked by Andrew's argument for the medieval origins of Hegelian thought and the Hegelian origins of theory, and thus for the medieval origins of theory. And in what turns out to have become a kind of traveling roadshow of our discussions on this subject, it has finally occurred to me, albeit a little slowly, that I need to pin down a firmer understanding of just what I mean by theory to explain both the depth of my agreement and the more precise point of my departure from Andrew's argument. In our last exchange, 2 months ago I think, I wondered whether, in its powerful attempt to recover Hegel's dialectical engine of figuration, Cole's genealogy of theory had not committed itself, though Andrew, I suppose, I know, has an answer for this, to an effectively Demonian sense of theory as literary theory, a practice referred ultimately to language, rhetoric, figuration, literature, etc. This is not so much a charge. It is instead, I think, the institutionally mediated conceit of theory with which we're all most familiar, the North American history of the post-war university. This is the generational sense that Maura invoked yesterday, one that is clearly embedded in the formation and history of Exemplaria, though others can speak to that with greater authority than I. And for what I've just shorthanded as the Demonian theoretical specter, theory as an intensification of the problem, mutatis mutandis, of language refracted. Even Frederick Jameson has assented to this characterization, though I should also note that he has characteristically contradicted that characterization. It's kind of the dialectic in action, I think. This sense of theory's emergence as a problem, literary theory, is certainly not wrong. And descriptively speaking, locally, genealogically, I agree with it. It's what happened as the Anglophone intellectual world sought to deal with structuralism. Theory thereby names the dialectical return of language upon itself, accordingly specifies something like a privileged literary domain. Now, as I say, Andrew has an answer to my query here, and I think it's a good one. We're still working on it, and we'll keep at it probably in the next iteration of this exchange. But there's a powerful and indeed necessary, I would say, alternative, which as it happens involves a different aftermath of that which Hegel has wrought. And so here, I thought I would try to sketch it. We need, I want to suggest, a sharper distinction between literary theory of this sort, with its roots not only in Hegel and figuration, but also in structuralism and Nietzschean metaphorics, and what I'll follow the Frankfurt School to call critical theory, equally but differently indebted to the instruments of German idealism. Under a regime of reification, which is to say ours, any version of critical theory, indebted to critical philosophy of a Kantian sort or not, but no longer isomorphic with it, will obviously include literature and figuration among its reified objects, along with any other cultural shape. But it will afford them no particular categorical privilege for just that reason. The point here is worth making because it's embarrassingly simple. What makes critical theory critical is the fact that it lacks a defined conceptual object, lacks any apparent purpose beyond that already encoded in every object it encounters. Unlike the Kantian artwork, those objects have their own purposes, but their originally distinct purposes, as art or philosophy or whatever, have been universally absorbed into a different final cause, hence reification. There's obviously no need to rehearse all of that, except to mark one crucial and constitutive condition, thereby underlying critical theory in this sense. This has to do with the working out of the Hegelian dialectic in one particular way, a way that turns out not only to evade its origins in Kant, but to invert the implication decisively. For these purposes, I can mark the difference between critical philosophy, call that Kant, and critical theory, call that what we do now, or at least what I think we can do now, simply by recalling the epical Kantian distinction between the postures available to philosophy as Kant understands it, between thinking and knowing. That difference is entailed in the prior distinction between appearance and the inscrutable thing itself. For Kant, the unknowability of the latter banishes knowledge properly understood altogether from the understanding. You can't understand the thing in itself. It thereby commits philosophy in a kind of purified Cartesianism to the prospect of thinking instead, understood in Kant's terms as the unity of representations. And this is the triumph of Kant, the double move by which limitation becomes confident assertion. One cannot know, but only think. But thinking turns out to confer a kind of domesticated, humanized representation of what knowledge might be if only we had it, which we really do, so long as we forget the difference that reification has already made, or Georg Lukács would term the hiatus irrationalis. The key here lies in the mediating relation, in the comfort of representation itself, which simultaneously withdraws any actual account of cause and reassures us that, if we did grasp cause, it would look more or less like us, familiar with the consolations of freedom, agency, and all the rest. Now, Andrew might dispute my paraphrase here, but we could grasp Hegel as the attempt to answer this challenge, to insist dialectically on a few points. First, that an ultimate unity of representations is actually and ultimately possible. Second, and here's the twist or problem, that it's simply not possible as representation, but rather as knowledge. Negation, Hegel would say, rather than picture thinking. Third, that what is thereby recovered is some version of the logical teleology that Kant himself had banished. In the language of the third critique, we can call that purpose or end. It seems safe to say, in the main, that Kant won this fight, that philosophy has largely remained a matter of thinking rather, excuse me, that Kant largely won this fight, that philosophy has largely remained a matter of thinking rather than purpose, a search for the unity of representations and a disavowal of teleology. And that Kantian premise works nowhere more powerfully than in the reassuring idea that theory is, finally, literary theory, gloriously non-purposive. Call that surface reading. It is here, however, that I want to situate the distinct enterprise of critical theory and recall its particular history. It derives, in a way, from this Kantian impasse. Kant's transcendental deduction had stipulated the impossibility of knowing, but it also leapt over the attendant difficulty by postulating this unity of representations, keyed to the unknowably transcendent that made thinking just as good for practical purposes. Kant had, that is, to presuppose and then to argue the fundamentally representative quality of appearance itself. The difficulty arises, as should be obvious, when that mimetic relation fails to hold, when things in themselves fail to correspond with appearances. For Hegel, this is negation, but as it turns out, in certain configurations, historically at least, negation is not a mere abstraction. The most devastating challenge to the Kantian hypothesis arises with the Freudian discovery of the unconscious, I think, which might be summarized in its implication to insist that the one thing that can never be meant by a representation is what it patently says. It could mean anything else, but it couldn't mean that. And as I've already intimated, the more systematic elaboration of this impasse operates dialectically in the Lukácsian account of reification. Here, the Kantian wager amounts to an ideological perversity. What has to be thought, but has to be thought as the very sign of thought's non-correlation with what in fact needs to be known, that is, the totality in which it exists, in which it is formed. Which is to say, what needs to be known is that totality of an integrated and abstract mode of production that has displaced nature entirely, while remaining impervious to a unity of representations. Reification, in Lukasz's account, or in the word capital, refines this Freudian discovery almost exquisitely. Thinking is certainly possible. Lukács calls it bourgeois philosophy, or just Kant. But thinking is now defined by its non-correlation, Adorno would say its non-identity, with the determinate field of what should be known. And as with the Freudian dream work, any unity of representations will be constituted above all else by the fact that it is wrong. But what is wrong is what we can read. Now, a little counterintuitively, I want to propose that this is the situation, this distrust of thought, but the simultaneous imperative to knowledge to which the need called theory responds, just as it did for the Frankfurt School as they attempted to work through the dual impossibilities of the unconscious and reification. And in light of recent events, one can't help noticing that the thinkers of Frankfurt have become our contemporaries again in some terrifying way. On one side, a fact of systematic determination, what Marx would have called all-sided mediation, etched in every object of thought, in every concrete effect. But on the other, the governance of a concept impervious to a unity of representations and reducible to none of those objects in particular, precisely because it is formed in the cause of what Marx terms a real abstraction, what Lukács names totality. The problem is that philosophy will not help us here, at least in its available forms. But it won't help us exactly because it remains bound to thinking, and thinking remains bound to representations that will avail us nothing. Hence the odd definition I want to propose as the ground of something called theory. The dialectic of reification has left us with our own version of a Kantian impossibility, driving thinking and knowing into fully antithetical relation. Committed since Kant to one side of this antinomy, philosophy maintains its capacity to regulate a unity of representations, but it cannot mistake those for knowledge. But knowledge remains a problem, objectively, the problem in fact, whether we call it the unconscious or totality or reification or capital, etched as the mystery of cause in every effect. If we are to do anything that we wish to call critical theory, it will need to begin here, somehow shaped in this bind, oriented toward the conceptual knowledge that inflects or distorts objects of knowledge without being represented there, which is therefore unthinkable, and which therefore requires some other medium than thinking itself, whether that is an unconscious, a work of art, or anything else. Now more briefly, teleology displaced. At the very least, and maybe nothing more than this, I expect everyone will have noticed that I've had nothing to say about the real historical range at issue here, and I'll plead guilty. I do think, though, that it might be controversial to say so, that the dialectic of reification, as I've described it, names the historical condition of the conjunctures I tend to study, a late arrival on the scene by several hundred years. Not only am I neither a medievalist nor an early modernist, but if the account of bourgeois reason I've sketched or borrowed holds, then it can't be said to apply equally to other historical modes of thought at all, to earlier periods generally. But this is just the provocation I wish to develop. If I had to point to the practical manifestations of theory as I've described it, I would gesture not to the canon of things we organize under that label, but to something like the avant-garde work of art, the cultural text generally, constituted, I would argue, by its encryption of a systematic knowledge that has abandoned the matter of representation. If I had to point to a philosophical attempt to work through that displacement of effect more generally, I would start with the modulations of theory and practice discerned somewhere like as in Althusser. Someone has to be the last Althusserian, after all. But that's a digression too. What I really want to frame here is the peculiar logical bind, eventuating from the discovery of this systematic non-correlation between thinking and knowing. The problem might also be described this way. The dialectic of reification imposes something very like a final cause or end, an unrepresented concept that remakes every object to which it stands in a relation of purpose. But it does so without leaving the evidence for which thinking would usually seek. In an Aristotelian mode, we would say that it inscribes the force of a final cause, but does so without divulging a formal cause. This is, in effect, the logical implication of Marx's discovery of the universality of the exchange relation, and the scission of final from formal cause, of material and efficient cause from the grounds of exchange. Final causes are integrated, but they're also withdrawn from the range of effects that we experience. Cause itself, as we've inherited the problem from Aristotle or Aquinas, has been divided against itself. This is the thing that always gets me in trouble in the saying, though perhaps not here, so I'll try to be careful. We're confronted here with the problem of teleology. To forestall any scandal in that, I'll just add 2 reminders. First, that teleology has always been a logical rather than a historical problem, not a prophecy, but a necessary proposition. Next, that what we have here is a teleology that we, quote, cannot by definition think, that no longer corresponds with any representation or appearance. It's there, but we could never formulate it. This is the situation to which critical theory first responded, a simple but procedurally impossible paradox. On one side, as Kant insisted, any simple teleological mode, whether derived from Aristotle or scholasticism or from the crude Enlightenment homologies of Kant's own day, has been displaced, rendered untenable. There is no path to the thing in itself. And yet, on the other side, a divided or scored or displaced teleology nonetheless subsists. For Hegel, that is the universal. For Marx and those after, still more concretely, it's the real abstraction. It's capital as such. And the universal, it turns out, is only rendered more powerful by the fact that it is represented in no particular, even as every particular reinscribes it as a fact. At one level, this is the great engine of Hegel's system, and I think Andrew is utterly right to discern something like that tension in Hegel's systematic use of the resources of the medieval to comprehend a modernity to which it does not correspond. But it is more definitively the problem of Marx, whose immanentization of the transcendental as real abstraction suddenly gives this teleology in abeyance absolute force, even while denying it expression. And if any part of that works as a description, we're left to think within a teleology that we also cannot think, even as we stipulate the ultimate impotence of our own thinking.
2 minutes, Dan.
All of this, then, I think that works, conditions my modest suggestion, my modest proposed definition of theory. Quite beyond any longer genealogy, the emergence, and I'll leave metaphors of birth to others, of critical theory's distinctive urgency as it took elusive shape in the interwar moment, roughly between 1919 and 1939, as critical theory marked an impossible exercise in teleology. It was, if I can put it this way, both a medievalizing challenge to its own situation and a dialectical transformation of medieval teleology as such. This is, in fact, how I want to define theory a little provocatively. It's something like scholasticism displaced. A scholasticism that can no longer trust the visible ends of nature to reveal final causes, that has in fact lost every conceptual confidence scholasticism once had, but an enterprise that nonetheless retains that causality as the central problem of knowing, even in negation. Something like this is what Adorno was always insinuating in his description of reification as a condition of nominalism. The problem of nominalism in that metaphor lies in its tendency to trust surfaces by forgetting that concepts haven't become unreal simply because they have become unknown. Critical theory, as I'm struggling to describe it here, resolves that conundrum differently by knowing that cause is exactly what it cannot think, but that cause nonetheless asserts itself as the thing to be known, still more urgently for just that reason.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Wan-Chuan, who's, let me find my other, what do I do with my other, sorry. Here's the introduction. Wan is an assistant professor of English at Washington and Lee University, where he is currently working on a monograph titled White Before Whiteness, which examines late medieval representations of whiteness across bodily and non-somatic figurations. And his title today is Precarious Figures, Rigorous Style.
Maybe I'll just get started.
There it is.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. No. Thank you for having me in this panel. I do feel very much as an outsider to the illustrious group here. I'm also being haunted by a term that Wayne Costeban once threw at me. He used the term theory maven. And I'm not sure that's a measuring stick or something, but I've been kind of thinking about our identities or my identity as perhaps not a maven or sometimes something like a theory maven. Is theory in a precarious state, or is precarity entering its theoretical stage? Or does theory remain as rigorous as ever? In a post-sustainability era, the rhetoric of precarity intersects with that of fragility in disciplines ranging from philosophy, and here I'm thinking about Judith Butler, thinking through ethics and Levinas in her 2005 book. Environmental humanities, broadly speaking, right? For example, we have people like Stacy Lemo, Jane Bennett, the vital materialist group. And then in the literary camp, we have, for example, someone like Stephen Metz and Jeffrey Jerome Cohen, the latest Cohen-ish incarnation. And I'm going to go through this a little very quickly. And then the social sciences, for example, Anna Lowenhoff-Tseng, whom we're going to talk about a little bit, to Marx's critique of late capitalism, for example, economist Guy Standing, the British economist, and his notion of the precariat. And then finally, we're thinking about more post-colonial and critical race studies in our moments of Black Lives Matter. Paradoxically, I think, the very language of theory is often so rigorous that it defies any hints of fragility or possibility of precarity. I'm thinking really medieval studies, for me specifically, engagement or disengagement with theory, I contend, is inevitably caught up in our current debates about what is precarious and fragile. And here I'm going to turn to Andrew Call's book. And is it okay if I call you Andrew? So, of course.
I can
I've heard worse.
worse.
So I take it as a compliment that you call me.
Andrew's very important and commanding intervention in the current moment, which different thinkers have labeled at different names, the Anthropocene, post-sustainability, or for my purpose today here a bit more narrowly, delimited as the age of precarity. And just very quickly, I think many of us are already familiar with the major aspects of Andrew's book. Of course, this is not exhaustive. Andrew has demonstrated the crucial medieval origins of Hegel's dialectics, especially Plotinus and his notion of identity difference, the kind of intricate binding and movement leaps between figuration and conceptualization, that is, figure does conceptual work. And Andrew demonstrates as well the Hegelian roots, hence the medieval roots of Marx's commodity fetish. He argues for the relevance of the medieval in the modern as well as the postmodern. In other words, as both Mark and Dan have mentioned, theories medievalisms. Right, and to me, I think in this very, very short paper here, the most important thing is Andrew's reconciliation of Hegel and Deleuze, or the kind of Deleuzian anti-Hegelianism, right, in order to save Deleuze from himself, so to speak. What I want to do today is to share some very modest reactions to a few select and very local moments in Andrew's writing, brief moments that force me to notice, to think about, to wonder at my relationship to theory, to text, to interpretation. And if this makes me guilty of channeling Roland Barthes, then I am. I am not proposing a new historiography. I'm not a philosopher or Hegel's scholar, definitely, though I definitely should read more Hegel, I'm sure, and get to know my closeted Hegelian a lot more better, or perhaps in my case, my closeted Confucius, too. As Lacan, whom Andrew evokes, states, quote, "Everybody is Hegelian without knowing it." And of course, in the eternal words of Honey Boo Boo, everybody's a little gay. What I want to share and reflect is how I sometimes approach theory, or more accurately, theories about theory. And back to Cole. And I think what's really important also is Andrew's calling out, rightfully, I think, at least for me in principle, right, presentism and its problems. He's skeptical of the value of some contemporary theoretical approaches, what he terms indifferent models of latent capitalism which do not contribute to critical thinking but merely stylize the present. And here are some textual moments. Exhibit 8, right? This is from a book. Delusionism without dialectic yields post-delusionism of the worst kind, whereby delusion theory and intellectual capaciousness is replaced by a hyper-stylized discourse, a free associative metaphoric mode of criticism in which figure overtakes concept in ways even Deleuze and Guattari could not have imagined. And the second one, this is from the PMLA cluster in 2015. Networks I admit, this is Andrew speaking, I have a certain counter-hegemonic democratizing appeal. They are so resilient as to be eternal, yet they are still systems in which a permanent interruption of systematic die-off ends everything in a flash, if not boom, and then what? Rhizomes, if you know anything about plants, grow by dying, the node being as much about death and disconnection as it is life or connectivity. Rhizomes also perish when conditions around them aren't supportive. I am not confident that these formulations help us think our uneven and troubled present. Rather, they seem to stylize it. I agree, I think, with Andrew's broad diagnosis, the presentism, or really presentisms, right? I think they're problematic and dangerous. And I'm just to cite a really quick example. For example, I'm thinking about the kind of crossing of environmental studies and transgender study in someone like Nicole Seymour, and also Gail Salomon, and thinking about the cross-section between the transgender study or trans studies and new materialism or vital materialism. Salomon tells us that a return to the real of the body, for which many, if not most, new materialists call, has troubling consequences, right? That can be seen in the work of several critics of transgenderism. As Salomon explains, opponents of sex reassignment surgery, right, quote, see this phenomenon as evidence that a real of the body is resistant to ideologies of gender, end quote. Right, so in here just a snippet, a very simplified version of what could be happening there with presentism and gender and transgender studies. However, I'm not so sure that I would categorically characterize some of these presentist ontologies, right, as indifferent or not helpful in helping us thinking about the present or the past or future. More definitely, I want to draw signs of certain feelings, tendencies, and prognoses, right? And my first thing that fascinates me with these passages from Andrew, that by mentioning style and hyperstyle, right, he seems to distinguish figuration from stylization. Is style then a dirty word vis-a-vis figure? If it's not a dirty word, perhaps maybe it's hyperstylization, the overkill that is dirty, right? Hyperstylized then is not rigorous enough, that is, concepts get lost in figures. And risking simplification, I detect as deep suspicion, I think, exposing a distinction, possibly a hierarchy between, on the one hand, dialectic figuration theory proper, and non-dialectic stylization theory improper. Above all, in the face of rigor, I wonder about theory's fragility and precarity in relation to stylization and figurization. And I want to consider how literary studies in general and medieval studies, right, in particular might negotiate, if not reconcile, two radically different conceptions of its relationships to theory, that is, one, theory as guarantor of rigor versus two, theory as carrier of fragility and vulnerability. The rigor of theory's language, which I think remains true in most writings we put under the rubric theory today, right, think of PMLA or critical inquiry. Theories, I want to think about theory's recognizability, right? Is it a concept or figure or conceptualization or figuration? How do we recognize theory when we encounter one, right? And is it because theory's figuration is rigorous, that it's hard? Is theory then like porn, right? That we know one when we see one, right? So another way kind of in jest here, right? Thinking about the way we do theory now, perhaps we can think as the ways theory is doing us now, right? This is kind of a weird moment going out here. I cite another example, right? The very rigorous, right, notorious language of queer theory and the paradigmatic Eve Sedgwick. And in her case, I think her her language, right? The difficulty and the combative ideation, figuration has much to do with the 70s and 80s, and definitely the AIDS epidemic, the political context that gave rise to that, and her kind of unbudging stance and personality, which is like a total split from her as a real person. You know, I met her very briefly while she was at the Graduate Center. Part of the reputed rigor of theory, of course, we know has to do with professionalization and academic code switching, but I think really, you know, coming back to the question of fragility, vulnerability, and precarity, right? Can we have a fragile theory or a precarious theory? This leads to the second thing that kind of fascinates me. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to do that. Is these moments when exercise systemic die-off ends everything in a flash, a boom, grow by dying, disconnection, and perish, right? And rather than thinking apocalyptic register, you know, death and destruction to presentism, right, which is here, but also among other things, also very medieval, I think, right? I'm gonna think in terms of precarity, right? And therefore, I kind of read this passage as, you know, this kind of precarious, hyper-stylized delusionism cannot save us from the age of precarity. And now I want to look at just a few moments from Andrew's book, right, or a quotation by Plotinus, right? And here he cites the rumination on Plotinus' rumination on wonder and paying attention, right? I'm just going to read this very quickly. We do not habitually examine or in any way question the normal we set to doubting and working out identification when we're confronted by any display of power outside of everyday experience. We wonder at a novelty and we wonder at the customary when anyone brings forward some single object and explains to our ignorance the efficacy vested in it, right? And this is quite an amazing and for me very illuminating connection to Heidegger, right? And I'm quoting Andrew here again, right? Plotinus' point here is almost identical to Heidegger's classic conceptual distinction between ready to hand and present to hand, right, between everyday Dasein, right, and I'm going to skip a few lines. And the exception of states we often experience when things break down and demand that we attend them as an object, quo object, right? And Heidegger here then expresses more fully Plotinus' point about the moments when objects disrepair, right? What Plotinus would term any display of power outside of everyday experience, right? That is, the state of precarity leads to the moment of noticing. And here's what's interesting for me is very recently Anna Tseng, right, offers a very different take on precarity and about noticing, right? And I'm quoting her here from her latest book called The Mushroom at the End of the World. We hear about precarity in the news every day. People lose their job or get angry because they never had them. Gorillas and river porpoises hover at the edge of extinction. Rising seas swamp whole Pacific islands. But most of the time we imagine such precarity to be an exception to how the world works. It is what drops out from the system. And I think if I'm reading her correctly, right, Tseng's arguing that there's this kind of opposite effect, right, the inversion of perhaps Plotinus and Heidegger, right, rather we have this desensitized new normal state, right, that we choose to ignore, right? That is, state of precarity is not about wonderment but rather willful ignorance, right? Now, going back to Plotinus a little bit, right, and before this discussion of Plotinus and about perception, and to look at a moment about Plotinus musing about human intellection negotiation of space. Thus, in local movements, if there is no particular importance to us in the fact that we pass through first this and then that portion there, without we perceive some particular point, we do not take notice or even know it as we walk. In a process unfailingly repeated with our variation, attention to the unvarying detail is idleness. So it is with stars, right? And then I'm going to quote Andrew here directly. The link between persons and stars is strange but interesting nonetheless, and enables Plotinus to say more, to say something different about the agency of stars and persons, basically to argue that these agents aren't intertwined. Stars are busy with their affairs as we are with ours. And for Plotinus, humans live in a world of difference, the stars are a world of identity, right? And if I can kind of simplify this, right, or kind of whisking that, right, it's kind of Boethian and thinking Macrobius' commentary on Dream Scipio, right, and Chaucer's at the end of Troilus, right, the kind of cosmic versus human mode. So we have this, but then of course we think about, right, the kind of usual suspects from new materialism or vital materialism, right, and people like Stacy Limo about transcorporeality, Jane Bennett's vital materiality and agentic assemblage, and Karen Barad's her term intra-action, right, in which this kind of enmeshment and diffusing of human agency in the non-human world. For saying then, right, that the need for us is to relearn how to pay attention because of precarity and because of assemblages. She says, we are surrounded by many world-making projects, human and non-human world-making projects emerge from practical activities of making lives. In the process, these projects alter our planets, right? To see them in the shadow of the Anthropocene's anthropo, we must reorient our attention. And going back to Andrew a little bit, right? He kind of uses this as the passage from Plotinus as an example, right, that Plotinus here exhibits a great capacity to think figuratively and conceptually at once, right? That is, Plotinus is the example of how the dialectical imagination is at work, and then he draws these two together, the humans and the stars, right? But I think, you know, if this is kind of thinking through agency, precarity, paying attention, and dialectics, right? And if I can venture to think about this, right, I think that, you know, then the signs and seeds, right, that may be hidden, right, of precarity, indeterminacy, and triviality are already within dialectic, right? In other words, figuration and conceptualization is always on the verge. For precarity, it's always a verge, right? A verge of being precarious, right? Indeterminate and trivial. And of course we can think, well, you know, not uneven development, of course, leads or, you know, is kind of the cause of precarity. And that is true. And here I'm going to quote from Jordana Rosenberg's kind of reading of Andrew and her their beautiful phrasing of how dialectical thought is the lead between the two, the uneven development between figure and concept. But in addition to uneven development, I want to think about Anna Tsing's notion of unpredictable encounter, right, which is not really the same as uneven development, which, according to Tsing, and you're going to read her again very quickly, precarity is the condition of being vulnerable to others, right? Unpredictable encounters transform us. We are not in control even of ourselves, right? So what I'm really trying to say, I think, you know, or kind of speculate, if I may, right, is not so much a refutation of the unevenness of, or the uneven dynamics, right, dynamism of dialectic as a shift in emphasis towards and perhaps a teasing out of dialectic's unpredictability and precarity, right, which, you know, may, of course, if you follow the white rabbit, right, lead to what Andrew terms a dialectical surprise toward the end of his book. Right. At the same time, I wonder if precarity will help us, mostly literary scholars, reconcile dialectics with vital materialism here, specific examples, and also with things like, for example, environmental anthropology, that is, to be careful in handling presentism and be thoughtful with hyper-stylization, right? And we have what we think of as the unpredictable encounter between figure and concept, right? The precarity of figuration and conceptualization, and of the dialectical imagination and interpretation. Therefore, what Jordana Rosenberg calls a critical friction point that mediates historical difference between the residual and emergent, right? This friction point, I think, really is an unpredictable meaning place. If Andrew's right, and I'm sure he is, right, that theory is always dialectical, always medieval and modern, always figural and conceptual, then I would say, just to add a little bit, right, that theory is also the staging of the precarious encounter, right? Tsing says that thinking through precarity changes social analysis. I would argue that thinking through precarity changes textual analysis as well, and perhaps theory or theoretical analysis as well, right? Theory may have a rigorous style, but it has a precarious figure. All right, thank you.
And now, in our own particular instantiation of the Word made flesh, we have Andrew Cole.
I'm so sorry.
Andrew is professor of English at Princeton University, where he directs the Gauss Seminars in Criticism, and he is currently completing the follow-up to The Birth of Theory, called Foundations of the Dialectic. His original title to his talk was Why Medievalists Should Read Hegel.
It remains.
Oh, good.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
You kind of need to karaoke your paper, you know, having just the whole thing projected on, and then you kind of read and sing along. Has that happened? I should have done it with your quotations, but.
So today also we make a case for why I think Hegel is so dang interesting, huge surprise, and why medievalists should engage his work and not follow our modernizing peers in sustaining cliched readings of this philosopher. In Hegel, one finds problems medievalists like to discuss simply, the problems concerning periodization, aesthetics, history, and the intellectual unevenness of history, and materialism as it relates to its false opposite, idealism. So let's look at periodization. Hegel has about the strangest periodization you'd encounter. To begin with, he periodizes history in different ways across his specialized works. If we were to go solely by his lectures on the philosophy of history, we would find an incredibly shrinking modernity, which begins quite exactly in 1789 with the French Revolution. If we turn to his lectures on the history of philosophy, we're in a different world where modernity begins with what Hegel calls the philosophy of modern times, which starts with Descartes. Neither of these two constructions, that concerning the modernity of 1789 and that concerning the modernity of Renaissance philosophy, will strike anyone as a surprising way to slice up historical time. However, what's interesting about Hegel is the totality of his thinking. When you start to line up the various Hegelian projects, the philosophy of history, the history of philosophy, the philosophy of right, the lectures on aesthetics, and so on, you see a great deal of unevenness in history where not all of the temporal parts correspond according to a tidy and transposable periodization. When Hegel says, for example, that modernity begins in 1789, he's showing that from the disciplinary point of view of the philosophy of history, politics lags behind philosophy. Because philosophy got to modernity before politics did. A statement about thought preceding action, reform preceding revolution, and France being ahead of Germany in so many ways at the time. As I've argued in The Birth of Theory and spin-off papers, Hegel is one of the early innovators of the idea of uneven development, a mode of historical thinking prevalent in the literature of the time, as James Chandler has shown in his analysis of anachronism and anatopism in English writing. In Hegel, we discover that the so-called progress of spirit isn't really so straightforward from the perspective of totality, or from the perspective of the totality of Hegel's thought. That circle of circles he announces at the end of the Encyclopedia Logic. In other words, spirit moves in mysterious and uneven ways. Hegel's lectures on aesthetics offer perhaps the most intriguing ideas about periodization. I forgot my water, so let me recall it. So in the lectures on aesthetics, Hegel discusses three major periods: the symbolic, the classical, and the romantic. Even if we grant that these lectures come from different years, we can still conclude that the bulk of his thinking by hundreds of pages goes to the romantic period. So what does he say? To begin with, for Hegel, the romantic period is crazily vast. It runs from the founding of Christianity up to his present day and includes what we would call late antiquity, the Middle Ages, early modernity, the various enlightenments, and for all the debates about the meaning and temporal reach of the term, the romantic period also includes what's called romanticism. Yes, Hegel's a big thinker, but this seems a bit ridiculous. At your peril, you pack some 1,800 years of history under a single rubric. Yet Hegel manages this unruly historical endeavor by the framing mechanism of the sequent genres, or the system of art, that is, painting, music, and poetry, an organization he shares with other thinkers, though often with different orders. And these formal or generic frames focus Hegel's attention, forcing him to be nuanced in a fashion you don't see in his lectures on the philosophy of history. A lot can be said about Hegel's conception of the Romantic period, but let me offer some ideas. The first is that it appears that both philosophy and politics lag behind art because art gets to modernity before philosophy and politics. Meaning that you could live in a world that gives you modern art but medieval philosophy and feudal politics or economic system. This also means that Hegel inaugurates a great dialectical tradition wherein aesthetics is the domain of a certain kind of political thinking or political expression. Another point I'd like to make is that the Romantic period for Hegel is a long modernity and includes the moments of late antiquity and the medieval period that we never think of as modern, but rather pre-modern. Start to see where this is going. Just to be clear, within this construction, the medieval is modern. In the Middle Ages comes the modern subject, which is the subject that is self-consciousness. Such self-consciousness is not available in classical antiquity, which is the age of consciousness without intersubjectivity and recognition. Antiquity for Hegel is the age without contradiction, which is, by the by, in Hegel's reading of Antigone, why you have these absolute differences between the law of the family on the one hand and the law of the state that do not overlap, intersect, interrelate, or indeed contradict one another. A world without contradictions, such as we see in Antiquity, is for Hegel a tragic world. This is to say, in short, that the great historical break in Western Europe on the questions of periodization and subjectivity isn't between the medieval and the Renaissance, as scholars in both fields are so accustomed to hearing and rehearsing to their respective chagrin and delight again and again and again and again and again. Yawn. It's not an imperative, it's a reaction. But you probably are yawning now, right? Rather, the break is between the antique, the late antique, and the medieval, with the latter falling on the side of modernity, named the Romantic period. So what are the stakes of including the medieval within the modern? From one point of view, it shouldn't be a surprise that the Romantic includes the Middle Ages, in light of the fact that the Middle Ages are everywhere in Romanticism, from the medieval word at the very center of the field's name, chromon, to the invention of the Gothic and other ubiquitous medievalisms, such as you see in Novalis, whose musings about medieval churches requires a cold shower afterward. Indeed, Schlegel's ruminations on the Romantic take in some select medieval works, but the difference here is that his definition of the Romantic does involve historical periodization. To be sure, for Schlegel, the term Romantic operates like a too-cool-for-school club, and high canonical and classical and modern works, no matter how lovely and gussied up they are, can only enter if they satisfy membership requirements that change at the door based on the whims of the bouncer. But the point here I want to make is somewhat about Romanticism and the relationship between Romanticism and the Middle Ages. Hegel's inclusion of the Middle Ages within Romantic modernity is less a product of Romanticism, as it was commonly practiced, and more a result of the fact that from a certain point of view, Hegel lived in the Middle Ages. First, Hegel's present was medieval to the core, in other words. The man himself, we recall, was born in Württemberg, a feudal kingdom that, as Terry Pinker says, had survived into the modern world. As a boy, he made his way to the Stuttgarter Gymnasium Illustra, whose curriculum was a mix of medieval and Enlightenment training. And as he walked to school, Hegel looked upon a town everywhere shaped by the old guild system. Apart from the university in Berlin, the German universities he could have attended were all semi-feudal corporations with inherited medieval privileges. However, Hegel chose the seminary in Tübingen, where he donned a long black monkish coat, the appropriate garb for a medieval city and university. Right from the seminary, he gained employment in an aristocratic household as a private tutor, more or less a domestic, another very old social station. During his downtime, he read works of English modernity in the household library, and chanted an anti-Bernese pamphlet attacking the quasi-feudal system upon which that very same household, his own employer, depended. When he arrived in Nuremberg to take up the job at the Gymnasium, this was the years between the years 1808 and 1816, he found himself in a fundamentally medieval academic institution run by guilds and lacking toilets. In 1816, 1817, he was in Heidelberg, whose beautiful ruined castle overlooked the town and whose university dated from the early 14th century. There, he participated in a medieval network of exchange, accepting supplementary payments for his work the old-fashioned way, in kind. By this time and in these contexts, Hegel had written many important works, including but not limited to the Phenomenology of Spirit, the Science of Logic, the Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences, and he was just beginning to lecture on aesthetics. and he was on the verge of publishing The Philosophy of Right in 1820. None of these anecdotes should come as a surprise when we recall that in Hegel's day, most of the population labored under servile obligations that extended back in time for centuries. James Day Sheehan, in his magisterial book called German History, 1770 to 1866, documents the fact that the German states remained feudal in Hegel's own lifetime and beyond. In these feudal relations, those feudal dynamics that are indisputably, it is these feudal relations, those feudal dynamics that are indisputably figured or expressed or in his most widely read section of the Phenomenology of Spirit called Lordship and Bondage. But many readers from Koshev to Hippolyte to Susan Buck Morse have read this passage incorrectly, as if to read the symptom of the passage and its aspirations for a trans-historical form of domination, as you see in Sartre's ethical notebooks, before reading what the immediate text actually says. It speaks of the Lord, and the bondsman, Knecht, which are medieval identities within feudal modes of production, named by the terms Grunderschaft and Erschaft, or Knechtschaft. I'd like to extend my point here about Hegel living in the Middle Ages and discuss some of the ways in which the Middle Ages were embodied in the built environments left over from that period and that were in Hegel's time still experienced as lived environments. This brings us back to the question of the Romantic, in particular Hegel's discussion of Romantic architecture in his lectures on aesthetics. On this topic about the Romantic, Hegel gives us the examples of Gothic cathedrals, because according to his scheme of arts, architecture is where you start. Here he assumes the role of a tour guide in the lectures on aesthetics, escorting the listener reader right inside a cathedral to gaze at the architecture. And so here's a quote here. Enter the interior of a medieval cathedral and you are reminded less of the firmness and mechanical appropriateness of load-carrying pillars and a vault resting on them than of the vaultings of a forest wherein the branches incline to one another and quickly meet. The cathedral presents a vault like this, one meant for reverie, this place of dread which invites meditation, because the walls and the forest of pillars meet freely at the apex. This is a great image. Enter the interior of a medieval cathedral and view the trees. Just a few pages later in the lectures on aesthetics, he's added again in his reflection on medieval cathedrals, this time stating that, quote, the whole church is divided and articulated by rows of pillars which resemble a forest and running together above in flying arches like boughs. In the number of these pillars and in the numerical relations of the interior generally, it has been proposed to find much mystical meaning. Of course, at the time when Gothic architecture blossomed most beautifully, at the time of the Cologne Cathedral, for instance, great importance was laid on such numerical symbolism. So bear in mind the images here again, the pillars that resemble a forest. Also retain the example of the Cathedral of Cologne, Hegel cites. We turn the page once more in his lectures on aesthetics to read about what happens inside a cathedral. In such a cathedral, quoting Hegel here, there is room for an entire community. If it is not time for high mass, the most varied things go on simultaneously and without inconvenience. Here, there is a sermon, there a sick man is brought in. Between the two, a procession drags on slowly. Here there is a baptism, there a bier. At another point, again, a priest reads mass or blesses a couple's marriage. Everywhere people wander around like nomads, or on their knees before some altar or holy image or other. All of these varied activities are included in one and the same building. Individuals and their doings are lost and dispersed like points in this grandiose structure. This momentary event, this is still Hegel, by the way, this momentary event is visible only in its passing away. Okay, end. So, what is this? Is this historical reconstruction? What is Hegel's point of view? I have some answers here among many others one could attempt. In the first instance, and this is the lectures on aesthetics, this is phenomenology. You could call it the phenomenology of the cathedral. For we have some classic Hegelian moves here. We have the idea of a totality that encloses a multiplicity of tendencies, actions, energies, points of view, what have you. It's the idea that with every totality comes its impossibility, not only the contradiction that at once comprises the totality, but the fragility of its constitution, the way in which, as he says here, quote, individuals and their doings are lost and dispersed like points in this grandiose structure. The momentary event is visible only in its passing away, end quote. There is no greater Hegelian theme than that, disappearance as a mode of appearance, and it's one that Marx took from Hegel in the Grundrisse. But that's all good and fine, because on the face of it, and this is another point, we are confronted with the inescapable fact that this is something like a materialist phenomenology, or a phenomenology of the material, because the postulated totality won't dissolve, can't be overcome, the contradiction can't break through, unless the cathedral we just entered with Hegel is actually destroyed. The totality is made of stone. You have to break the stone walls to overcome this form. And I would note that Aufhebung is a term that's often used to describe the destruction of medieval buildings and the abolition of medieval institutions in the Reformations, and elsewhere Hegel uses this term in that exact way. Which is very, it's news to know that Aufhebung is the central term of the dialectic, so the convergence of those two ideas as relating to the negation of the medieval and the negation of, in the end, the negation I find fascinating. So the truth of the matter is that this totality is still preserved because this building still stands. It's not that Hegel is engaging in historical reconstruction or obligatory romanticism in this. Rather, he is purely witnessing. How do we know? I have to admit that it was an exciting moment of discovery for me to find that Hegel writes about the cathedrals he visits in his letters, and that these letters are literally written into the text of his lectures on aesthetics, in what is an amazing conflation of experience and philosophical exposition, which would be, of course, the point of the phenomenology of spirit, but who knew it could get so literal, so real? So, for example, on September 28, 1822, he writes about a certain cathedral to his wife, Mary. Cologne is huge. I searched out the cathedral right away. In the cathedral, one vividly beholds, in every sense, a different dimension, a human world of a quite different sort, also of another time. There is no question here of utility, enjoyment, pleasure, satisfied need, but only a spacious ambling about enveloped by high halls that exist for themselves, and as it were, simply do not care whether people use them for whatever purpose. It's personifying this cathedral is extraordinary. An empty opera house, like an empty church, has something lacking in it. We encounter here in the cathedral a tall forest, though admittedly a spiritual forest full of art, standing for itself, existing there regardless of whether people crawl around down below or not. It could not care less. What it is for itself. It is made for itself, and whatever ambles or parades about within its walls, or tours about it with a green oil knapsack and an admittedly still unlit pipe in the mouth, that is, in other words, Hegel, is, along with the caretaker, simply lost in it. All this standing and walking around in it simply vanishes in it. Here we have Hegel in the Cathedral of Cologne, as we have seen in the passage from the lectures on the aesthetics. Here we have the notion that the cathedral is used for whatever purpose, as we had seen in the passage from the lectures on aesthetics, with one thing happening here, another there, people coming and going, get this sick guy out of here, and so forth. Here we behold the tall forest, that is, the inside of the cathedral, as we had seen in the passage from the lecture on aesthetics. Here we have the activity that vanishes as soon as it transpires, as we had seen in the passage from the lecture on aesthetics. And finally, we have the cathedral as what persists, not only against the ravages of time and reformations, but persists because it is what it is, and then some. Quote, what it is for itself, it is made for itself. Hegel walks right into the medieval world, the Gothic world, because he can. For this is the world that persists in his time, the Middle Ages, and the built environment of that time that lingers in his present, which is a present 20th and 21st century readers of Hegel quickly erase in the name of a unitary modernity. My friend Rebecca Kamei would probably be the example you know best if you're even into the Hegel thing. Things are so obvious about Hegel, said no one ever. But I think my points are, so I can be quick with my conclusion and impress Patty with my celerity. If one has a stake in the Middle Ages and in theory, indeed in a theory that is quite distinct from philosophy in its Kantian form, I just can't see how you can get around Hegel. For me, Hegel marks a crucial beginning in the history of theory, something I would dare call an origin. On the table for discussion, among many of the things that we've already heard, are the terms periodization, medievalism, romanticism, presentism, philosophy in the present, theory in a decidedly uneven age, the past persisting in the present not as a ruin, but as a material defining feature of the modern, and whatever else you can think of. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm impressed with the disciplined way in which our speakers kept to their time. Some even going under their time, in fact. And I want to open it up to questions. And I see Val right away. Yeah.
Two quick comments that link Mark's and Dan's paper. Dan, there's a little Latin couplet that knocked around the Middle Ages, talking about typology, you know, the fourfold level of meaning. And roughly translated, it goes, the letter teaches the deeds, allegory teaches what you believe, the moral teaches what you do, and then the anagogic, which is final cause, where you're going. And I'm always struck by the ablative use there, rather than the accusative, and so that it's the telos is always only ever an intention and an orientation. And so I'm not disagreeing with your point about the scholastic confidence, but I think it leaves room for the possibility of doubt and of non-attainment, and that's really where I would connect with Mark's comments on the split subject. And Mark, I was reminded of the work of Steve Kruger when you were talking, because he talks about, he's working on St. Paul and the impossibility of conversion, and there's some rich confluences between what you're doing and he's doing.
Yeah.
More.
I'm sorry.
No, go. I just wanted to give them a chance to respond if you wanted to.
They weren't questions.
No, they were just, they weren't.
Not to say, yeah, I think that's brilliant and exactly right. The distinction I would make is not to impute a kind of confidence in transparency to a scholastic mode, but rather perhaps a confidence in unity, which suggests that the division of intention between what can be encountered as formal cause and what will emerge as final cause is somehow coordinated beneath one's own sort of formulated intention. This thing I'm calling the displaced scholasticism maintains those terms, I think, without the sort of confidence in the underlying unity of a belonging to the same system, as it were.
Can I just briefly, another way of putting the thought would be that if you're committed to the view that there actually is such a thing as an ontological source of being that is the same as an ontological source of the good, that is the same as the ultimate target of desire, you're open to what Nietzsche describes as incredible refinements of self-torture that are distinct from the forms of self-torture that emerge in a world that lacks that confidence. And that's, I think, what I was after with the sense of a fundamental point of orientation that's fundamentally disorienting.
More.
This is a question for Mark. I was really interested in your talk because I was at a medieval colloquium at Berkeley, and I found myself saying to the graduate students after it was a student was presenting, and I found myself saying to the students when it was over, Steve Justice was there too, and your generation, it seems to me, said I, yes, is committed to a notion of unity and wholeness, you might say redemptiveness, in a way that my generation was not. And so this is somewhat my version of theory, or my version of how the sort of the critical perspective that we brought to, or that many of the people you cited brought to literary texts was slightly different in that the historicism more broadly, as it was implemented, was interested in things under the influence of post-structuralism in gaps, fissures, aporias, moments of disconnection. When you looked at a literary text, you were not looking for its unity and wholeness, you were looking for the ways in which it was resistant to unity and wholeness, and you weren't looking for its redemptiveness. And so as a critical practice, those were the kinds of things that we were certainly learning how to do in graduate school in the 90s. And then it seemed to me that this particular student who was presenting was giving a reading of Julian of Norwich, which was all about unity and wholeness, which was exactly the opposite of anything that anybody at Duke would have done in the 1990s. And not to say she was right or wrong, it's not really a comment on that. It just seemed to me that many of the younger generations that I've encountered were much more invested in institutional, what I would think of as, readings that were about the ways in which texts conform to this is, this is an Augustinian text, or, and here's the ways in which it's an Augustinian text, or this is a text in which I can see the influence of this nominalism, and here are the ways in which I can see that influence, rather than this is a text that's pushing against X, Y, or Z. And it was interesting to me the people you cited, because you cited Ellie Johnson, who is Steve Justice's student. Steve Justice is John Fleming's student. And Steve Justice himself is in that line of people who are interested in wholeness. Nikki Zeman, again, is from a tradition of people who are very interested in readings that are about redemption and wholeness. I think of David Ayres here, with whom I cluster her. I don't think of them as typical of I think the people you selected are not necessarily typical of a kind of generation. I mean, I just propose it as a counter narrative of, it seemed, maybe you'll respond that you weren't, that what you're arguing is not, you are not providing a narrative of the way you see critical theory over the past, say, 20 years. But I took it that you were suggesting this is what critical theory has done over the last 20 years, and you are providing, with your reading of the split subject, pressure against what you see as a redemptive hypothesis that everyone has been invested in. And I just don't see that everyone has been invested in a redemptive hypothesis. I think it's quite the opposite.
Right, so I guess I would say that what you're describing as a feature of a current generation of graduate students also sounds like a description of what many of our teachers who, were not Aranya Friedenberg or Carolyn Dinshaw were holding out as the necessary parameters of any account of any medieval text or medieval culture per se. So in fact, I was trying to make a non-generational argument, or even an anti-generational argument, that we continue as a field to be against many of our own best efforts, and not so much invested in a fantasy of the Middle Ages as whole or something like that, but because we've critiqued that till the end of the world. But that there's something we're somehow not quite able to bring into focus. I mean, and so maybe Nikki Zeman is not the best example, but take Vance Smith, for example. So if anybody has taught me a lot about Langland, he's the guy. But the idea in negative Langland that there's some kind of relationship between what Langland is doing and a certain mode of negative theology is still the idea that the negativity inside that text has as its sort of determining telos some kind of directing of the subject beyond towards an encounter with something that is transcendent. And I want to funnel that in the way that Vance has taught me to do, in a lot of ways, right? Back into the kind of rough work of that whole text. I mean, I think you know, if I could cite Wittgenstein for a second, there's a way in which we keep finding ourselves on ice, and we need to go back to the rough ground to get some traction. And I don't think that's a generational. I think we want to tell a generational story about that. That's a Whiggish story of intellectual progress, and I don't think that's right.
But to what extent is that are you talking in part about the very conditions of criticism? In other words, is there something about right, the nature of writing a critical essay, say, that always, you know, is always going to move towards some kind of recuperative move, even if the bulk of that essay is about the rough ground, if you see what I mean.
Yeah,
there's always going to be,
I would actually say
right?
it was like, is there the implicit nostalgia of the historicist dilemma? Like, is there, right, as medievalists, this is what we are, even as we try to distinguish what we are from what they were doing. Are we kind of recursively coming around to a kind of nostalgic structure of, not that historicism was a particular word you were using, but I was just thinking about that while you were talking, which I think is that there's a redemptive structure to that. That's our edge in the nostalgic relation. It's really provocative, though. I like your paper.
No, it's really provocative. Melissa.
Thank you. Thank you guys all for your papers. They are giving me a lot of thoughts about this sort of medieval theory, sort of straddling that we all have to do. My question is specifically for Andrew. So you're talking about sort of the personification of Cologne Cathedral and these Hegelian aesthetics, and I wonder how you might figure the concept of ductus into Hegelian aesthetics, is at least architectural ductus.
I haven't thought about that at all. How would you?
Well, I mean, I've argued in the past that it, you know, belies an agency to the architecture, to the material, in a way that sort of actually contributes to our discussion, our panel on materialism yesterday as well. So if you want to talk about that after, I'd love to.
No, yeah, I would like to, and I think that's a fantastic observation. I hadn't even thought of it, so I'd love to hear more from you.
Thank you.
Katie.
Yeah, that was such a great panel, and I have lots of questions, so I'm not even really sure who to ask. So I guess I'll focus on Dan the first time. So I was really interested in your kind of in your argument about the scholasticism as, you know, as an influence in that moment of critical theory in the Frankfurt School, and I was wondering. So in that book by Anthony Grafton and Lucy Jardine about humanism, one of the points that they make in the introduction is that scholasticism functioned very well, right, in the Middle Ages, and so that when humanism appeared, it was it kind of had to promote itself, right, as being now this is what we do, right, when we educate people, and in order to distance itself, and we're not going to do that anymore, even though it was effective in its own way. And so I was wondering if you saw that moment where you're saying scholasticism reappears as in some ways also a response to humanism and its kind of discontents, or at least its project, and how that had maybe been vitiated or changed over time.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I'm probably the last person to say anything reliable about humanism in any of its senses, historical or philosophical or otherwise. It comes with being the last Althusarian. But I mean, my sense is, and again, this is the inexpertise that I'll happily own, attached to my somewhat distant and perhaps metaphorical sense of scholasticism. But you know, it seems to me, I mean, I would tend to buy, and I don't know the details of Tony Grafton's and Jardine argument, but I would tend to buy a sort of larger sense of the history of philosophy that has kind of Hegelian root to it, that scholasticism falls apart, right? That it may be pushed in the end, but you know, it collapses of its own weight. Not because not because of any kind of internal logical weakness, but rather because the world that it has gathered has fallen out from under it. And so, as Patty and others know, my sort of strange fascination with these accounts of nominalism, but also I think in the emergence of a kind of Cartesian dualism, one has the same thing, the sort of picking up of the pieces. So I don't know that and I guess this is the distinction I would make in trying to think of a kind of displaced scholasticism. What I guess I mean by scholasticism there is not any particular philosophical system or dogmatic regulative order, but rather a set of problems that emerges from this first postulate that the world to which thinking is referred is organized into a kind of totality. Right? That's the one thing scholasticism had, right? And the kind of Cartesian mode has to pick up the pieces of the disappearance of that. The strange paradoxical effect of a kind of Lukashian or Frankfurt reading of Marx in reification is that it turns out that singularity was actually right. It was just a different, or now it's a different singularity than that one was. So one is under something of the formal compulsion that scholasticism was to organize everything, but without reference to what would be necessary to organize it. So I don't know if that answers the question or makes sense, but it's close to either. I'll take it.
Jessica.
I also have a question for Dan Blanton. I loved your paper, and I guess I'm just wondering if the object of theory is knowledge, right, and not thinking, and cause must be thought and must be known. And I think you gave us 3 things that address knowledge, and one of them was the avant-garde work of art.
Yeah, this is just what I think.
Yeah, no, and I believe it. I wrote it all down. But I guess my question is, where does that leave literary criticism, since most of us are literary critics? So do we describe the avant-garde work of art and how it works and the way it addresses knowledge, and is that what we do? Is there anything else for us to do?
Yeah, I mean, and this is again where I tend to get myself in trouble, but with other constituencies probably. And one of the reasons I would go as a kind of privileged example to a certain avant-gardism lies in the willingness to jettison the category of art entirely. That it does not follow from that there is no art, that one stops making art, right? One has the problem of anti-art or what have you, in a more high-toned register. One has, this is just confessing my own origins. I'll attest for it. But a kind of Eliadic problem of how poetry gets written. The sort of challenge of a certain modern text, which has to think through the impossibility, as I would put it, that the poem actually knows more than the poet does, because the poet doesn't know anything at all, right? The knowledge is all entirely in the poem, there to be sort of reassembled in some sort of way. So part of this, and this maybe goes back to the sort of uselessness of neo-humanism, but this particular version of knowledge, I think, is a kind of what I take to be a kind of systematic anti-subjectivism, lying in the most powerful modes of critical theory. A sort of displacement of the cognitive subject as such, that if we are going to imagine knowledge, imagine is even the wrong word, we can't mistake the sort of premise that we had it. It has to be somewhere else, something like externalization. I don't know if that actually.
Thanks.
Drew's next, and then.
I was just wondering if Andrew could respond more explicitly to what I take to be the implicit challenge in Wan-Chuan Cao's presentation, which is that slide in which the word stylization becomes a kind of dirty word, almost a slur, about the way that there's this sort of broad delta of Deleuze Incorporated, call it Edinburgh University Press, right? Hugely prolific dissemination of, maybe we could call it nouns, not verbs. That is, everybody wants to tack rhizome onto things, and kind of applicationist deployments of becoming as if it was a kind of salt on food that otherwise wouldn't taste very good, right? That there's a sort of style problem, but surely Hegel, of all people, is not someone who's dismissive of style. I mean, and he's not a philosopher that is somehow, you know, on the side of rigor rather than style. So it may be that there's a false choice. I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit more about what troubles you about bad deployments of style, or if in fact you want to concede the force of this critique that I think we all felt, you know, had some interesting purchase, but also maybe, you know, you could kind of recalibrate what it is that troubles you about bad deployments of philosophy.
Yeah. Thank you for that question, Drew, and thank you for that paper, Juan, because that was excellent, and I sort of, you know, gave me the chance to think and rethink, so I really appreciate that opportunity. I think that as I was hearing you ask your question, it dawned on me that some of my issue with style is a similar issue with description. When I'm talking about stylizing, so in other words, the surface reading problem again, that criticism is merely describing the present as it is, and which I feel like it can be done in a number of ways. And what's breathtakingly beautiful about Deleuze and Guattari, and just to be clear, I have lots of Deleuze stuff in there, so it's not like you can't do any Deleuze, you can do something.
We're so relieved.
Yeah, no, so you can run back to your hotel.
But you should do less.
Yeah, maybe not so much. But the passages that you cite, Juan, are great, and just in terms of the opportunity to rethink, and it's the question of what I find that what's at stake with the issue of style and description is, where is an outside? We've lost the outside. It's not just a question of, well, at first it's a question of uneven development, in the sense of there is an outside to capital and modernity still, which is, as medievalists, we have an obligation to recognize that, which I think as a medievalist automatically makes you kind of a dialectical thinker and kind of Marxist in a way, to recognize that, the persistence of the present in the past, not in some, you know, kind of vatic or erratic way of oh, we must care about identities in the past, people in this vague way of a kind of intersubjective connection, but that our modernity is shaped around and built over and paved over the past as a materially present thing, or what Sartre calls the practico inert, these kind of buried agencies that around that are the, you know, the cow paths that's now the highway, for example, okay? So sedimented past human praxis that persist. So my interest in that is the question of the outside. Now in Deleuze, you have an outside that is a fold. That, you know, in his book on Leibniz, you don't really have an outside. And I'm looking for an outside. And I think that what was interesting to me in hearing your formulations about precarity is you said it was an outside as well. I believe, if I'm not misquoting you, but that there's an outside to an institution, there's an outside to access to resources, there's an outside to clean water. I mean, just if we give up that notion of an outside, we give up the notion of critique, and I'm not ready to do that. I'm not into this whole post-critique thing, I'm not into this surface reading thing. You know, I would rather do old school ideology critique than merely description, and which to me feels like stylizing the present. So those to me are the stakes.
Okay, so like a name that hasn't appeared at this conference yet, Spinoza, it might be that for you, stylized description works the same way that sadness does in Spinoza. It decreases our capacity to act.
Oh, wow.
And so we sort of lose the purchase that critique might have given us.
Yes, it is. And so, I mean, it's no secret, obviously, that I have something to say about object-oriented ontologists and all this kind of stuff, right? The quotes from Morton in a previous paper, it's about the present being, you know, inherently melancholy. Like, you notice that. I mean, that's an extension of, that shows sort of his past as a romanticist, because that's everything's freaking melancholy. But now everything totally is, you know, all the turtles all the way down, or elephants all the way down, is a melancholic world. And I think it connects with that. And just to say, if I can add a point about scholasticism, Spinoza was a scholastic. I mean, you cannot read the Ethics and not recognize a freaking medieval encyclopedia in its organization. I got in a debate with Etienne Balibar about this, because he's in the school of like, oh, he's a modern thinker, it's a way of getting around Hegel, and so on and so forth. And we had this really, probably a stupid argument about how it begins. Go look up Trevisa's translation of Randolph Higden's encyclopedia. What's the first chapter? De Deo, it begins in God. Go to the Ethics, read the first chapter. Where does it begin and what's its title and rubric? De Deo. It begins in God. It's organized like a medieval encyclopedia. Spinoza was absolutely a scholastic, as was Christian Wolff, who was Kant's predecessor and was the craze all in Germany.
Kant was exactly the breaking point here.
Yeah, and you have all these, this scholasticism stuff doesn't go away, and it's not just kind of like in the ways that I'm guilty of this, of the pseudomorphs, the kind of Blumenbergian reading of it, where we have no, it's actually again there as scholasticism. It's not echoed or mirrored or whatever. It's actually what it is, and so that's interesting.
If I could just jump in here, Andrew's next, but just to ask, because the question I had at the very end of that occurred to me at the very end of your talk, Andrew, was to what extent do you read Hegel in the cathedral as medievalism, as a brand of medievalism? And do we want to distinguish between types of medievalisms, some that are more stylistic and others that are more, or that you see as more, I don't know what the alternative to stylistic is anymore, so if you could just,
I think that's exactly it. I'm down with medievalism as long as it's a capacious category and not limited to kind of flourishing in style and creative anachronism, which is not what our field thinks it is anyway. There's a very rigorous conversation about medievalism going right now, and a capacious one. But I kind of want to, and even just the sort of, when I'm evoked in relationship to Bruce, his is kind of like, Bataille edited a medieval text, and you had to do, that's what people did in universities in the 20th century. You had to do medieval crap. You used to have to learn Old English to get through the freaking graduate program, right? I'm talking about a guy who lived in the Middle Ages and who is everywhere in contemporary critical theory. I don't care what you say. That's a different kind of thing, and again, that's what a medievalist would notice, and that repositions us to the past and the present all at once.
But you could argue that that's not then medievalism.
Yeah.
That's medieval, right?
Yeah, I know,
and I don't want to
it.
overly define, divide
it.
stuff, but right?
You said it. No, I do. That is medieval.
Sorry, Andrew, you're next.
Sorry. Be patient with me if I struggle to articulate this. I thought all the papers very interesting, went together really well. There seemed to be a recurring argument whereby modernity was very much associated with, I suppose, Kant and Kantianism, with static or transcendental systems of thinking, or bourgeois rationality, I thought was one term which was used to describe it, as opposed to dialectical thinking and the association of critical theory and contemporary critical theory, the history of dialectical theoring, which goes back into the Middle Ages, which is something you can, I suppose, if you're someone who's a traditionalist and argues that we're being anachronistic in using modern theory, the answer is, well, actually, no, the modern theory is more medieval than it is modern, if that makes sense. I don't know. So I thought that was Mark's sense. But there is another sense of modernity which is really, which hasn't been mentioned and seems really important and relevant here, which doesn't concern the differentiation between transcendental thinking as opposed to dialectical thinking, but more basically secularization, that we as critical theorists or literary theorists or art historians, we're not theologians. It's obvious, And well, I'm not anyway. I'm not going to talk about my religion, but it doesn't exist. And the and nevertheless, I think this is important because when we come to our own thinking, or thinking of ourselves as involved in this tradition of a history of dialectical thinking which goes back into the Middle Ages, it's transformed in the present, it's transformed in modernity, and in a potential way which contradicts this whole tradition we're trying to establish. If we're secularists, if we have to become, I suppose, Marxists or ideological critics of ideology, it's not just a secular theology, it's one which is also an analysis of secularization, all that's solid melts into air. So we live in a tradition and we work through theories which in a way erase tradition. So my question, it's not really a question, it's a rambling sort of stream of thoughts and confusion. My question or provocation would be, to what extent is our own dialectical tradition that I hope we've not invented here, but to what degree has it got its own internal contradictions? So, which we cannot really. The traditionalist, I suppose, would come back to us and said, "You're a secularist like us. We're modern in a way we're not into the past more basically." But to what degree does that, I suppose, undo this tradition, this dialectical history that we've connected, being secularists? I've not articulated it well. I'm still thinking about it, but that's my question.
I'm not actually sure quite how to respond. Partly because when one invokes secularization, that's such a loaded term, right? There's always, what does one mean? There's some sense in which something has happened, but how to specify that, I think, is really, really hard. Partly because it's really, really hard to know how the hell to say what's happening in a quote-unquote theological universe as well, I think. So beyond, so again, like what are the consequences of it being a kind of grounding assumption for everybody that there is such a thing as God, and that God is the unity of being and the unity of good and the target of desire, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I guess what I'm trying to do is just slow down a little bit and ask for some further rethinking of what that entails, because I think we're inclined to be way too quick, even when we're trying to slow down about that. I mean, not to like cite Lacan or anything, but to cite Lacan.
That's almost a quotation.
Yeah,
Exactly.
Yeah. But like, if God is dead, he's always been dead, and plus God isn't dead. I mean, it's so. I don't have a confident answer, but that's in fact in a way my response. I think we should not be very confident about our answers there.
In the face of that warning, can I give it a sort of vulgar shot and suggest that a secularization understood as a narrative, I think becomes a problematic trope here. But if we kind of literalize the term, whether in a kind of Weberian or Bloombergian or whatever sense, I think it's possible to think of secularization as a kind of renomination of value. The Cologne Cathedral works very well, right? The value of the Cologne Cathedral is theological until the moment of literally secularization. There's a political seizing of the cathedral. And along the way, what we find is that value is ultimately, I would say, economic. And when we were talking about secularization, when we were talking about modernity, as with poetry and theory and all of this, I have a bad habit of being invested in the terms I also want to forestall. But we are talking about integrated economic value, in a sense. So yeah, I don't think that's a contradiction. I think it's precisely a kind of dialectical attention to those original antinomies and their kind of deeper logical imbrication that we need in order to make secularization a useful descriptive concept in an historical sense, not in that other sense.
Any other? Yeah.
I'll ask one. This is somewhat jumping off of Andy's question, and is mostly directed to Mark also. Since Andy brought up secularization, or at least that very loaded term, it made me wonder if the redemptive hypothesis that you're talking about, and this tendency, or this repetitious tendency, or kind of like side effect of reading these texts, I mean, if that might not, I mean, like if the redemptive hypothesis is like a refiguration or a translation of like the traumas of secularization or the traumas of the reformations of the church. I mean, and I'm thinking of that mostly in terms of England or English literature. But if that, we attempt to not do it, we are not completely aware, or like a reading might not be completely aware that there is some buy-in into that. The desire to kind of find some sense of unity or redemption, whether it's someone like Julian of Norwich or in the Canterbury Tales, for that matter. And so I'm just wondering if they're linked. I mean, and maybe I'm asking kind of an impossible
I
question.
mean, well, that's certainly it's one, again, that's one prominent form that we've spent a lot of energy and time and in quite precise ways uncovering and critiquing and getting past. But I wouldn't want to try to reduce the range of things that I see as continuing to exhibit the grip of this intuition to repetitions of Reformation ideology or something like that. Sorry, I don't have a more capacious answer than that.
Rachel.
Yeah, this is for Andrew and Mark. It kind of connects a question you answered in your paper. Mark, you talked about how, particularly in Langland, but in Ricardian poetry, there is, in Langland particularly, these dead ends have reparative purpose. And they're redemptive for the reader rather than in the text. And I'm thinking about what Andrew said about the melancholy of object-oriented ontology and this idea of dead ends, and whether, I was just wondering whether you think it's this same sort of reparative for the reader, if not reading the text, this move towards a similar, thinking the crisis of the 14th century, this same sort of trying to repair some loss that can never be recuperated. And talking about like the genealogy of theories, which Mark mentioned as well, if that's doing similar work of trying to say something again and again in multiple different ways from different lenses, and then somebody in the next generation picks up theory from 2 generations before in this similar reparative process. And I was just wondering your thoughts, whether you feel like I'm totally coming out of left field or...
I mean, I think one place where we really strongly agree is that there's a very close relationship between the reparative and the melancholic, that they're repetitions of each other, and we're trying to think our way out of the box of the Hall of Mirrors or something, and that there's a false set of choices available if you're thinking, well, so if Langland's not a figure of melancholy, he must be a figure of some kind of reparation or something. And thinking of Langland as a writer and a thinker who is deeply indebted to a long tradition of thinking that identity is configured in an ongoing relation to a difference that is never, that's its constitutive condition rather than something that it can banish is I think a really important, it's been given me some important terms for thinking about what he's up to.
I think that answers it entirely, so I don't want to, waste time saying other stuff, but just, it just kind of like, because, the Franklin's Tale has come up in several readings of like object-oriented ontology, and I can totally see why. I still like the old psychoanalytic reading myself. It's the same way you think that, like, this fucking red light is like conspiring against me. I mean, when she looks at the Grizzly Rocas, it's about like them caught up in her projective fantasy. I don't think the rocks have any kind of agency at all except to kill threateningly, which they don't. Average's coming back. So it's a great example how the world frustrates you and is kind of subject-centered in a particular way, which is how I see Chaucer looking at how I think Chaucer. And I want to say too, since you mentioned Lacan, that we won't mention. I was hearing, and I may be mistaken, but a lot in common with just the late Lacan versus the earlier Lacan, which is the primacy of the death drive as what constitutes the subject above everything else, which then persists after therapy, after the abolishment of capitalism, according to Samuel Tomsich and Todd McGowan. I mean, that it's not the sort of there's no cure in Lacan. So you have that split subject, this is what, that continues on through, where it's not a reparative scenario. And so I think that the late Lacan in that way, and again, according to like Samuel Tomsich and Todd McGowan, is like singing music with you, Right?
Yeah, absolutely. And the fact that guy was raised by Catholics and was smartly thinking in relation to it, I think is really, important there.
I think that's great. Yeah, I think that's right.
Thank you.
Thanks for that.
Well, please join me in thanking our wonderful audience. So we extended the discussion 15 minutes into the lunch hour, but we have a good, still hour and 40.